All right, so let's talk about a session of R, right? So let's say you're working with R and now you're going to be creating variables. You have to store something, and especially when you want to load stuff that you've been performing or saved for later on. So certain terminologies that you have to become familiar with, one is the workspace, right? So a workspace is where your variables and your functions are stored. Not the actual commands that you'll be saving in the history or the editor, but the actual function and objects that are there. So the name of the default workspace, so by default meaning if you don't give it a name, by default it just leaves out the name. The name would be simply .rdata. Okay, so when you're first saving your environment and you go into that directory later on, you will see that there's a .rdata file. Now, to load this .rdata file, you can just use the load function, or there are basically pull-down menu options in RStudio that say load default workspace. Now, the other important thing is your working directory. Now, this is the directory where you'll be, where R is going to look for things when you ask it to load something, or when you tell it to save something. This is the place where it would save it. And this is also the place where the default workspace is expected to be, and also where the history commands or the .r history file are going to be saved. So it is a good idea. This is kind of like, you know, good practices when coding in R is to assign one folder as your project folder and keep everything in there. So all your input file, your output, designate that as your working directory, and so that whenever you load that directory up, everything will be in that one place. Okay, so when you're using the console, there are ways of getting information about your workspace and your work directory. So in the console, if you typed in get wd, it would tell you what is the working directory, right, that you're in. You can also go change your directory to a different place and make that into your working directory. That's also an option called set wd. You can save an image. So basically, image is actually your workspace. So in this case, you can give it a name of your workspace and then a .rdata at the end, and that will save it again in your working directory. You can load this later on from another project or another session to read it in and do your analysis. The dir command is to give you a list of all the things that are in your working directory. Now note, in R, whenever we use these functions, they all have parentheses, okay? That's going to be important because it'll help us distinguish when we're using it as a command versus when it's actually a data object. So in RStudio, everything becomes a lot simpler. So in RStudio, there's a tab on the top for workspace that allows you to load a specific workspace or even the default workspace, but we can also save your workspace and it'll ask you for the given name. Or again, if you want to save it as the default one, that's what it would be called. And you can actually see down here, there's a .rdata file and a .rhistory file. So this naturally becomes or is available to you in your default working directory. Now, in RStudio, that was the workspace. Sorry, for the working directory, there is an option here. Sorry, let me go back. So here, when you see in your file system, if you click on these three buttons, you can actually navigate throughout your file system in your own computer. And once you go to a directory where you have the information you need, then you can use this More tab to tell it to set this directory as your working directory. Okay? So these are the two ways so you can navigate your workspace and your working directory in R. But then RStudio also has projects, which basically encompasses everything and makes your life much, much simpler. So you don't have to worry about your working directory or your workspace. It just manages everything. And the way you do this is basically you use the Projects tab here. So in this example, I was already working on a project that you see here, but when you click on this pull-down menu, it gives you all these different options of creating a new project or opening a project that already exists. Now what you can do is when you click on the new project, it will ask you, do you already have a directory? You want to make it into your working as your project directory, or would you like to create a new one and go on that way? So in the live coding demo, we'll create a project where we're going to store all our initial first intro or lecture commands. And this way, next time when I open that project, it will automatically load the workspace and it will set that directory as my working directory, so I won't have to navigate or find any other places. So I highly encourage you to use this projects feature in RStudio.